You're listening to Faith, Relationship, and Community Podcast, where we talk about all things faith, relationship, and community. My name is Noah. I'm the lead pastor of Morningside Lutheran Church. Today, we're joined by Phil Hamman, and we're going to be talking about what it means to develop strong faith. Phil, you got a lot to share.
Well, yeah. It's been an interesting ride, that's for sure.
Yeah, it has. Well, let's just start there. So, you've been a coach for how many years, and where did you start, and how did you get into coaching?
Well, I probably coached for over 30 years, 35 years. I started when I went into college. I started coaching young kids at the YMCA up in Sioux Falls. That's my hometown.
Okay.
I started coaching way back when I was in college. Mm-hmm. And then I just always continued either volunteer youth coaching and then, coached middle school or high school sports, and even went back and at the college that I was recruited to be a sports wrestler for. I went back and coached with my head coach that recruited me.
Okay. Yeah.
So I've coached from the grade school, middle school, high school, and college level.
All the above. Yeah. So what I think has been fascinating, just getting to know you, you've really integrated faith into coaching. Coaching is a lot more than just learning the sport.
It's a lot of people want to think of coaches as trying to get kids to win, but coaching is developing people for their whole life. The rules and the commitment that we learn through sports should help transfer over into everything we do in life. Yeah.
Yeah. And so tell about the experiences that you've had in that with your students.
Well, in a public school, and it changes all the time, but, you have to be a little bit careful with, during doing faith things in a public school.
Yeah.
I got to the point where I had a very strong Christian principle. And back in those days when I was coaching, you couldn't just get on the internet and research things legally and stuff like that. So you had to go by what your principal would say.
Sure.
And he just said, I would like the kids to have time to say a prayer if they wanted to, or a prayer before we compete, or some time that they can have for themselves. What is it? And he said, well, just have it be student-led. So I always found an athlete that was a Fellowship of Christian Athletes, or a strong Christian person to lead the prayer. And I never, pressured the kids to be involved. It was their time. And then, we tried to do that before every time we competed.
Yeah. And you did that. Did you ever get pushback in a setting?
Never did.
No.
Never did. Never got any pushback by any students or athletes or any of their parents.
Yeah. How receptive were the students in that setting? So when you have student-led prayers, what did you see in just the connection of the students in their faith?
Well, I saw, when you've got good, strong leaders, and the leaders are good, strong people of faith,
mm-hmm.
It's kind of like anything. If your leaders are doing things that they shouldn't be doing in life,
sure.
It kind of feeds down into the team. And if
Right.
you've got leaders that are going to be setting good examples in their lives and in their faith, it trickles down in. So I always tried to get some of my best leaders that were also people of faith to be role models, and it seemed like it really trickled down into the teams.
Sure, I could imagine. Seeing that role model, because you probably had the other side of it, where there are good players who are not great role models.
Yeah, it's just like, it just depends on who's coming through those classes and who's coming through those sports teams, whether it's football or wrestling or basketball. What is the character of the leaders?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of people are they? How are they leading their lives? Are they people of faith? Are they going to be people that are going to do things for the glory of God?
Yeah. So talk about that, because obviously every student has just a different family life and home life. Is that difficult to just connect with students in maybe a faith way or coaching way and in their own lives?
Well, and it's when you've been in the system for 40 years, now we get into certain books. I did 10th grade English for a long time, but you're doing certain books that have different religious overtones, like
mm-hmm.
the World Trade Center attacks. And
Sure.
So you're able to discuss all the different types of religions in the world, including Christianity, and what their philosophies are. And so I used to always start out and ask kids, now, no matter what, how many of you are a member of a church or a member of a faith group?
Mm-hmm.
And, 40 years ago, we'd get half the class would raise their hand.
Sure.
And my last few years in, we'd only get a couple kids raise their hand out of classes of 30, 35 kids.
So the landscape has changed quite a bit.
Yes, it has. It changed. Well, I saw it changed immensely. Kids knew what denomination they were. They knew what faith they were, you know. And, we're getting a lot of Muslim kids now in the schools and a lot of kids from other, we're really becoming a melting pot of various religions.
Yeah.
And, we try to do a level of respect for everybody's beliefs as much as we can.
Yeah. Especially as you're working as a coach, though. I mean, I'm sure that would be tough differentiating between Christianity and other religions that are.
It is, and you've just got to, and again, it's a public school, so you've just got to be very careful. It's got to be student led, and it's no pressure to do it.
Right.
And, it's got to be something that the kids want to come to themselves. And that's where you've got to have strong leaders where the kids want to be drawn to it, I think.
Why were you passionate about that?
Well, I didn't grow up with going to a church. I grew up in a federal housing area. I actually, as a young man, I was in a lot of trouble. One of my best friends that I grew up with was arrested 43 times, did over 23 years in prison, over 4 stretches. Very intelligent, but very criminal. And I'm actually a Hall of Fame athlete out of the biggest high school in the state of South Dakota. For a 19-year block of time, I was the winningest athlete in my sport, in that school. And I just got inducted in that Hall of Fame. But back in those days when I was competing, it was all about me. Yeah. What could I do? What other award could I win? It was all about me. And then the coaches started telling me some things that opened the door. They started saying, they'd set us down and they'd point to me or they'd point to other people and they'd say, don't you think that this sport is just for you? Because it's not. You're doing this for other people.
Yeah.
You're doing it for your parents, your girlfriends, your friends, your teammates, for us as coaches. Yeah. This is more than about you. And I started thinking, okay, I've got to make sacrifices for other people, but it was other teammates.
Sure.
I never thought on the lines of it's for the glory of God. And it wasn't until my mid-20s that I came to Christianity and really started, even when I was a young coach, it wasn't Christian based. It was just teaching young kids the fundamentals. Now, I did learn some values, about commitment, about, dedication, about hard work.
Sure.
I learned a lot of those things.
Yep.
But it was never about God back in those days. Yeah. It was just about me or how I could maybe, as a coach, you have an ego trip if your teams or your individuals are winning too.
Sure.
And look what I did.
Right.
And it wasn't about the glory of God back in those days.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I really, the Holy Spirit came to me and became a person of faith that I realized that I was blessed with something. And what can I do, whether I'm writing a book, which we've written 7 books and 3 national bestsellers.
Yeah, we'll talk about that
we
here
do
in a little
spin
bit.
on Christianity and those. So, what can we do to reach everybody we can for the glory of Jesus Christ?
Yeah. So how did that change? I love that you say that. I mean, what would you tell the Christian athlete today that maybe wants to start thinking that way? What does it mean to play the sport and even coach for coaches out there for the glory of God? What does that look like?
Well, from the smallest seed is going to come the largest plant. We all have connections to different groups of people. And whatever connections we have should be our way of helping from the largest seed grow to come to the largest plant. Yeah. Now, for me, it happened to be football and wrestling. Other people are going to have connections with soccer or volleyball or swimming or rhythmettes or dance.
Yep.
But they all have the ability to make a connection. And not just in coaching. There's all kinds of people in the construction business and all kinds of places. They're going to be rubbing shoulders with all different kinds of people who don't know Jesus Christ.
Yep. I think about that today, especially with youth sports. I know many young families, young kids who are just busy with traveling sports during the summer, or things are just kind of different and shifting, and even being able to maybe be around on a Wednesday night or Sunday morning, but they're out there in the field. And I think it kind of steps into that. Obviously, there's this commitment of coming together as a church, but also you're connecting with people in the field who might not know Jesus. And so how can that look? I mean, how would you encourage that?
It's leadership. It's what can you do? I mean, it might be wearing a cross necklace and letting it hang out. I'll see a lot of NFL coaches do that, and they proudly let that be seen by millions on TV. Yeah. And I'm going, wow, that's inspirational.
Isn't that neat?
Because there is just a tiny little bit of connection that might spark something. If everything springboards something else.
Yeah.
It might be the sight of a coach that you respect wearing a cross necklace. What's that all about? I've heard of this Christ and this cross thing, but I don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
Okay. And then from there, you can have your students or your athletes of more faith. They can rub shoulders with kids that are maybe lost and have never been exposed to Christ, and maybe they can invite them to a church activity.
Sure.
To a Wednesday night. Well, there's something else that's changed. Back in the day, Wednesday night practices were a no-no. No,
Sure.
No, we weren't playing any games on a Wednesday night.
Right.
No
Wasn't
youth
happening.
sports.
Is off.
That's changed too now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was talking to a pastor in, I think it's Wyoming. He said right now that they haven't really had a lot of that activity yet. There's still no sports on Wednesday nights, but he knows it's coming.
It's coming.
Because and again, this is more of a remote area in Wyoming, but he knows, it's all advancing no matter where you're at in the nation.
Yeah. It's just from politics to jobs to schools to whatever, things are just constantly, but one thing never changes is the love of Christ.
Yeah. Amen.
And there it is for all of us.
Yeah. Is there a coach you've looked up to? And as far as you became a player and then a coach, with faith a big part of your life, and seeing a coach play out in that same role or as a role model as a faith leader?
I really like Tony Dungy's style of coaching when he was coaching with the Colts, and I read his book. I've read his book 3 times actually.
Yeah,
Quiet Strength by Tony Dungy.
Yep.
And wasn't even going to write a book. He didn't want it to be about him. Only if it was going to be about the glory of God.
Yeah.
And the things that he did and how he helped his athletes, develop a stronger faith or come to the faith of Jesus Christ. So Tony Dungy is a real strong influence.
Some students now that you've coached, and different students that you've seen kind of grow into maybe a strengthened faith. Talk about that. It's pretty cool.
Well, I've seen one of my athletes here about every Sunday.
Yeah,
who is pretty well grown when I was coaching him.
Yeah, and now in church leadership.
Am I allowed to say his name?
Sure,
Kirk Bradley.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay,
Yep.
Kirk Bradley was my heavyweight wrestler in high school, and of course a tremendous football player and a person. And if I've got this right, I don't believe Kirk Bradley missed a day of Sunday school in 12 years from kindergarten through high school.
I believe it.
I think that was one of his claims to Christian fame is he never missed a Sunday school all through for 12 years.
Yeah.
And so obviously I'd ask Kirk when he was in high school if he would be interested in, leading any prayer of anybody that would be interested before we competed. And of course he always did.
Yeah.
And then when he wasn't around, I'd try to find other athletes that would do it.
Sure.
Because, it still can't really be coach led. It's got to be student led or athlete led in the public schools. And like I said, it's you read those you read those different lawsuits and different things online, and you got to be a lawyer to interpret half of them, or where does this really mean? It kind of says this, but it kind of
which I am not.
Yeah, it kind of does say this. So I'm not giving any legal advice. I'm just saying a lot of our coaches that are probably going to listen to this podcast are probably they might be club coaches or it's private, and they pretty much can do. Probably they would want to check it out, but I'm sure they can do a little bit more than what a public school coach can do.
Yeah. How would you, even outside of like coaching and some of the students, a lot of parents that listen to this. And so what would you say to the parents of student athletes and just the importance of pouring out faith into their sport?
Well, again, it's like, as an athlete, and especially as a young athlete, it's really an ego trip, especially if you're a pretty good athlete. It's about me. It's about me a lot of times. And they've got to learn that, of course it's about you, but it's also about your teammates. It's about other people around you. And of course, it's for the glory of God.
Yeah.
What has God given you as a talent? What can you do? And because of him and because of been given these talents, how can you use that to glorify Christ and what he did?
Yeah.
And it's like, no matter what we do, every time I come to communion or I see that cross in the front of the church, it almost brings me to tears to think of what Christ did for us.
Yeah.
The best coach we could ever ask for.
Absolutely. And he exemplified that in his life of selflessness.
Right.
That it wasn't, it ultimately is all about him, but he did this all for not him, but for the world, because God loves his creation.
And when we pray, as athletes and parents of athletes, encourage them to pray. Start out by praying prayers of thanks to start out.
Good. Thank
you that I was born with a strong, healthy body that I can do this. Thank you that I'm able to do this. Thank you that I'm able to perform and maybe for the glory of your name And if I can bring like Tim Tebow, the great football player, I read Tim Tebow's book not that long back. And, when he was a quarterback for Florida, he started putting Bible verses under his eyes in the black, the shadow grease. And so then it started to be about what Bible verse are we going to read that Tim Tebow's got on tonight. And so he used that position to spread Bible verses in the Word of God.
It was one of his games. I can't remember which one. Maybe you do. Where he had the John 3:16 on here, and it was the most Googled searched thing that night.
That's right. Now, there's just one example of thousands we could sit here and try to give.
Yeah.
But there's one example of a young athlete who is willing to use his platform for Christ.
Yeah.
And so it's pretty inspirational.
I'm sure that is as a coach too, to see that out of students.
And then when Tim Tebow was being heavily recruited coming out of high school, heavily recruited by many top Division I schools.
Yeah.
And he wanted a strong Christian coach. And he ended up finding one.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your books. You've written books, and that's been kind of a passion for you.
Like I said, I grew up in kind of a bad area. My best friend and 3 kids were murdered in a horrible mass murder. We wrote a book called Gitchy Girl that profiles the life of a teenage girl that lived through that mass murder, true story that went really big. And, her road to recovering from that mass murder and finding God herself. And so we throw a Christian spin on the end of those books.
Yeah. Those are available now. Still?
Yeah, they're available.
You got copies.
Yeah. They're all over the internet on Amazon and things like that. So,
but you had quite a journey, right? Talk about, the experience of writing a book like that and writing a story and what you guys went through and publicly through.
Well, did a lot of speaking at churches and with youth groups, going around the Midwest after the books came out, and where are these stories going to lead us, and what do we do? And I'd run into different pastors here and there, and I remember one time I told a pastor, well, I was never going to write a book. And he said, Phil, you were always going to write a book. It had to be, God was waiting for the right time for you to write the book, and now look what you've done with the Christian spin on a horrible story.
Yeah.
And, one of the things I like to, have people, question me at a book talk, and they'll say, well, if God is so powerful, how could he have allowed those 4 boys
That's one of the leading questions.
How could he allow that murder to happen? Or how could he allow that young girl to be taken and sexually assaulted?
Yeah.
I said, one thing you have to remember is there's a war being waged on this earth between good and evil.
Yes.
Okay. And sometimes good loses some battles. And out at Gitchy Manitou that night, when those boys lost their lives, just a battle was lost. But you got to remember the war has already been won through Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
The long-term war is going to be won. It's already won. Yeah,
absolutely. And we can't forget that. That's a good word, Phil. That there is a spiritual battle that's taking place.
That's right.
And you know what? God grieves those moments too. And he doesn't cause them to happen, but when they happen, he can work in them.
And that's one of the toughest things that I had to face at first was, how can that happen? God, if there's such a powerful God, how could he allow the Holocaust to go on? How could he allow this to happen?
Yep.
And I said, you have to remember there's a war being waged between good and evil on this earth for the minds and souls of people.
Yeah.
And sometimes bad wins a battle here or there.
Yeah. How did you, how was that book received? What's some of the feedback you've heard from just the faith side of that story?
Well, there's at the end of the Gitchy Girl book, towards the end of the book, we say that Sandra Chesky, the survivor of that massacre, that all her friends and one of my best friends was murdered that night. She came to the realization that God doesn't just allow things to happen, that there is a battle between good and evil, and that he lost the battle that night. Yeah. But she will go on to be a strong person and not be bitter. And she's one of the most godly and nicest persons you can meet. Here's somebody that could be bitter against the whole world after what she went through.
Yeah.
And so I've had people come and stand up and read that portion out of the book and break down and cry.
Wow.
And say, this meant so much to me because I harbored a lot of resentment towards God because of something that happened in my life. And this helped put it in perspective that sometimes bad things do happen in this world.
Why did you want to write that?
Well, again, I don't know why we were going to write that book. Sandra, I wrote a memoir.
Yeah.
I first of all, as a Hall of Fame athlete, I never I put my medals away, when I came to Christ, and I didn't want even my children growing up to see what I'd done as an athlete and feel pressure to do what I'd done or try to match or beat what I did. I didn't want that. And I never told my children about, growing up in a bad area and getting in a lot of trouble and doing a lot of things that a person shouldn't be doing in life. Yeah. And so I never shared any of those stories. And it just came about 9-10 years ago. I was in a contemporary lit English class, and the kids had to write a personal narrative, something that happened in their life. Could have been a vacation, a time they broke their leg, whatever. Sure. And we had kind of a difficult class. They didn't want to write their personal narrative paper. So if they didn't write it, they were going to end up flunking first quarter. It was a big point.
Sure. It's a big deal.
I made a deal with this class. I said, look, I'm going to go home tonight and pen one story, a personal narrative that happened to me, and I'll read it to you. And if you like it, you guys all have to agree to write your papers. We'll help you get them written. And then I'll tell you another story. And so I went home and I penned a story that was called Firearms and Dogs about this neighborhood I grew up with was loaded with vicious dogs. I mean, back in the day, and there were rabies scares, and it was just a lot of bad dogs. Let me tell you, mean dogs. Sure. And it was about how I got attacked by this, probably the most vicious dog in the neighborhood. It was half wolf and half German Shepherd.
Yikes.
And how, my experience on that. And the kids loved the story. So they all wrote their papers. They got their papers written. So then I told them another story about this neighborhood. And then that was going to be it. And the teacher I was working with wanted to know more. So at lunch, she was asking me questions. And she said, well, Phil, you need to write these stories down. Just take a spiral notebook and write these stories down for your grandkids and your great-grandchildren so they'll remember all these stories. And so that's what I did. Yeah. So they were just handwritten in a spiral notebook. And when I was done, she wanted to read them. And she brought it back the next day. She was in tears. And she said, you need to send this to a publishing company. I said, absolutely not. I go, there's great authors that spend their whole life trying to get a publishing contract.
Right.
And so she said, I think you should send this off. She said, it brought me to tears. I think it's very inspirational. And I said, well, I'm not going to do it. And I didn't. So my wife took the spiral notebook and she typed up all the stories just how I had them written, which I'm kind of embarrassed about because the paragraph structure and things are not right. I just wrote out the stories.
You were writing journal
so
style.
Then she sent them off to several publishing companies. Wow. And one day, you know how you can be a little bit curt. Sure. I get a phone call and it was a gentleman on the other end. He said, is this Phil Hamman? I said, yeah. And I think it's telemarketer or somebody trying to sell me something.
Sure.
And he said, you got a couple minutes to talk to me? I said, look, man. I go, yeah, I got a couple minutes to talk to you, but make it quick. My time's pretty valuable. And he starts laughing. He goes, I think you're going to want to talk to me. And it was the CEO of a publishing company.
Wow.
He said, I got your manuscript on a Friday night. And he goes, I rarely do this. I stayed up till 1 a.m. and read the whole thing. Wow. He goes, we want to offer you a contract. I said, well, being the non-trusting person that I am, I'm going to check you out. And so I told my wife, you check these people out, make sure this guy's legit. And he was.
Yeah.
And so landed a publishing contract. And then, they're selling them. And that had a Christian spin on, my memoir. Okay, and then they wanted more stories. So I wrote a second memoir with a Christian spin. And then after that, Sandra Chesky, the lone survivor of the Gitche Manitou mass murders, I've known her since we've been teenagers. She read my memoir and she contacted me. She said, Phil, for 40 years, I've never shared anything about that night. But I loved your memoir. I think it's time for me to share my story that I can reach out and help other women who have been sexually assaulted. So that's how it came about.
Wow. And so you wrote it. And do you still connect with her?
Yeah. Was in communication with her last week.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah. And so, and so we try to put a Christian spin on everything. And so, it's like anything. If you're a musical group and you're cutting CDs and they're making money, they're selling, they just want more.
Right.
And then that's how the books came about. But all it came about from one story with one contemporary literature high school class on one day that sparked 7 books and 3 national bestsellers and
amazing
3 Hollywood documentaries and
unbelievable. So I know when we were talking about this conversation with coaching in particular, you didn't necessarily want to make a plug in any of that. And so I'm asking you, where can we, I think it's really neat for people to kind of figure out where to get that. And so we can put that in some of the,
if you're like true crime, they're pretty rough. I'll have middle school teachers contact me and say, can we use this book for required reading in middle school? And I said, well, maybe upper middle school, maybe 8th grade. But I go, couple of my books, no, the crimes are so rough. It's adult material.
Yeah.
There was a serial killer operating out of my hometown that actually went to the same middle school and high school that I did. That's a really rough book.
Really?
And and we put a Christian spin on that too. But
where can we find these?
Well, just all you got to do is go onto Amazon and Google Phil Hamman author, and all the books will
pop up right there. Yeah, good.
And if you're on an ebook, you can get them for like $3-4.
Sure.
I mean, they're really not very expensive, but they're true crime, and try to write cliffhangers and leave the so that's kind of the direction that went. And again, trying to put give the glory to God for even a horrible story.
Yeah.
How can this shine? How can God shine through this horrible story and bring people back from such a bad experience? And Sandra Chesky is a good example of that.
Yeah. A lot of people can hear that message. I think can really connect to that.
Yes.
Any inspiration of writing more books?
Well, we're going to have another one released here in November. We weren't going to write any more books, but we got contacted. Our publishing company was bought out by a bigger publishing company.
Okay.
And they saw the sales of the other books, and they contacted us. They said, we've got a retired drug enforcement agent out of New York who is involved in one of the largest, most violent drug smuggling rings in the United States.
Wow.
And helped bring it down. And he wrote a book, but it's just, he's got a great story, but he reads more like a book report. He needs somebody to co-author it with him and turn it into a good story. And so we connected with this drug enforcement agent out of New York and wrote a book.
And that'll come out around November?
They think about probably the middle of November.
Okay. Well, good. We'll look out for that. That's great. Well, Phil, thank you for having this conversation.
Well,
and time flies, doesn't it? But it's great and encouraging to hear. And my hope and prayer is that other coaches, students, parents can grab onto that message of faith and how important it is in their sport.
It's like, every little bit of a connection you make. You come to church one Sunday, and maybe the pastor's sermon doesn't mean much to you that Sunday, but maybe the next Sunday it really hits home, or hits home for somebody that you know.
Right.
And just same with a book. You might read a book, you might say, I know this person should read this book.
Yep.
It's that's kind of a thing. It's all these connections.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for being here and sharing that.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. You bet. Thanks for listening today to our Faith, Relationship, and Community podcast. For more episodes, check out our website, morningsidelutheran.com, or on our social media platforms. We appreciate you joining. God bless.